Have you ever wondered how a single moment of inspiration can change the entire course of human history? Picture this. It's March 10th, 1876, and in a cluttered workshop in Boston, a young inventor spills acid on his clothes and calls out in panic to his assistant in the next room. Those words, carried through a wire and reproduced perfectly on the other end, would become the first sentence ever transmitted by telephone. But here's what most people don't know about Alexander Graham Bell. The telephone wasn't his greatest invention. It wasn't even his main passion. The man who connected the world through voice was actually obsessed with something entirely different. Something that would consume his entire life and drive every decision he ever made. I'm going to take you on a journey through the complete life of one of history's most misunderstood geniuses. A man whose story is far stranger and more fascinating than the sanitized version you learned in school. We'll explore how a speech therapist became an inventor, how a single patent battle changed the course of technology forever, and how Bell's true obsession led him to achievements that make the telephone look like child's play. But first, let me give you a glimpse of just how extraordinary this story becomes. Bell didn't just invent the telephone. He created the first successful hydrofoil, pioneered aviation technology that influenced the Wright brothers, founded National Geographic, helped establish the Smithsonian, and developed technologies that wouldn't be fully understood until decades after his death. His patents were so valuable that they created the largest corporation in human history. His influence on modern communication, transportation, and even space exploration continues to this day. The man who started as a shy Scottish boy, afraid of his own shadow, would become one of the most powerful inventors in American history. But the price he paid for that success, and the personal demons that drove him, reveal a much darker and more human story than the legend suggests. Let's begin where it all started, in the fog-shrouded streets of Edinburgh, Scotland, on a cold March morning in 1847. Alexander Bell was born into a world obsessed with sound. Not music, not poetry, but the mechanics of human speech itself. His grandfather, also named Alexander, had transformed himself from a cobbler's son into one of Edinburgh's most respected elocution teachers. The elder Bell had developed a revolutionary system for correcting speech defects, and his students included members of the British aristocracy who paid handsomely to learn proper pronunciation. But it was Alexander's father, Melville Bell, who would truly shape the boy's destiny. Melville was a man possessed by an almost scientific fascination with the human voice. He spent countless hours studying the precise movements of lips, tongue, and throat that create different sounds. While other fathers told their children bedtime stories, Melville would demonstrate how the vocal cords vibrate to produce different pitches. He was developing something called visible speech, a written system that could represent any sound made by the human voice, regardless of language. To young Alexander, known as Alec to his family, this wasn't strange. This was simply how the world worked. Sound had shape, voice had structure, and speech could be broken down into its component parts like a mechanical device. The Bell household was a laboratory where human communication was dissected and analysed with the precision of a surgeon. Alec's mother, Eliza, brought a different kind of influence to his life. She was a portrait painter with an artistic sensibility that balanced Melville's scientific approach. But Eliza carried a secret that would profoundly impact her son's future. She was gradually losing her hearing. As Alec grew from a toddler into a young boy, he watched his mother's world slowly fade into silence. This wasn't the sudden deafness that might result from illness or accident. It was a creeping, progressive loss that stole sounds one by one. First, she couldn't hear whispers. Then normal conversation became muffled. Eventually, she could only perceive the loudest sounds, and even those were distorted beyond recognition. Alec became his mother's bridge to the hearing world. He learned to speak directly into her forehead. where she could feel the vibrations of his voice through her bones. He developed an intuitive understanding of how sound travels through different mediums, how vibrations can carry meaning even when traditional hearing fails. While other children his age were playing with toys, Alec was experimenting with ways to make his mother's life less isolated. The Bell family lived at 16 South Charlotte Street in Edinburgh's Newtown, a neighbourhood designed with mathematical precision during the Scottish Enlightenment. The streets were laid out in perfect geometric patterns, and the buildings rose in elegant Georgian terraces that spoke to mankind's ability to impose order on chaos. It was the perfect environment for a mind that would later revolutionise human communication. But Alec was not a model student in the traditional sense. He was dreamy, distracted, and often seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear. His teachers complained that he stared out windows instead of paying attention to lessons. What they didn't understand was that he was conducting his own education in acoustics. He was learning to identify birds by their calls, to distinguish between different types of footsteps on cobblestone, to hear the subtle variations in human voices that revealed emotion, health, and social class. At age 11, Alec made a decision that would define his character for the rest of his life. He was tired of being called simply Alexander, like his father and grandfather. He wanted his own identity, something that belonged to him alone. He chose the middle name Graham, after Alexander Graham, a family friend his father particularly admired. From that moment forward, he was Alexander Graham Bell, a young man determined to forge his own path. The transformation wasn't just symbolic. Graham, as he preferred to be called within the family, began displaying an intensity that surprised even his scientifically minded father. He started conducting his own experiments with sound and vibration. He built crude speaking tubes to carry his voice to different parts of the house. He created primitive hearing devices to amplify sounds for his mother. Most remarkably, he began developing what he called a mechanical alphabet, a way to represent speech visually that expanded on his father's work with visible speech. When Graham was 12, something happened that would shape his understanding of invention and discovery for the rest of his life. He and his older brother Melville, known as Melly, were visiting a flour mill owned by John Herdman, a family friend. Herdman complained about how labour-intensive it was to remove the husks from wheat before grinding. As a casual challenge, he suggested the boys might try to invent something to make the process easier. Most children would have forgotten such a suggestion within hours, but Graham became obsessed with the problem. He studied wheat kernels under a magnifying glass, analysing how the husks attached to the grain. He experimented with different tools and techniques for separation. Finally, he and Melly created a device using rotating paddles with rough surfaces that could effectively remove the husks through mechanical action. Herdman was so impressed that he used their device in his mill for several years. But for Graham, the real revelation wasn't the success of the invention. It was the process itself. He had identified a problem, analysed its components, experimented with solutions, and created something that didn't exist before. He had taken an abstract idea and made it physically real. The feeling was intoxicating. This early success gave Graham a confidence that set him apart from his peers. While other teenagers worried about social acceptance or academic performance, he was driven by a deeper need to understand and improve the world around him. He began to see every mechanical device, every natural phenomenon, every human limitation as a puzzle waiting to be solved. His formal education continued at the Royal High School in Edinburgh, but Graham's real learning happened at home and in his father's workshop. Melville Bell was developing an increasingly sophisticated understanding of phonetics, and Graham became his most dedicated student and collaborator. Together, they mapped the precise mouth positions required to produce every sound in the English language, and many sounds that didn't exist in English at all. This work with visible speech wasn't merely academic. Melville Bell had discovered that deaf individuals could learn to speak by copying the mouth positions shown in his system, even if they had never heard the sounds themselves. Graham watched his father work with deaf students, teaching them to form words by showing them exactly how to position their tongues and lips. It was like giving voice to the voiceless, and Graham found the work deeply moving, but there was a darker side to Graham's adolescence that would haunt him throughout his life. His younger brother, Edward, known as Ted, had always been the frail one in the family. While Graham and Melly were robust and energetic, Ted was delicate, prone to illness, and seemed to exist in a shadow cast by his more dynamic older brothers. As Ted entered his teenage years, he began showing signs of what we would now recognise as tuberculosis. The disease progressed slowly but relentlessly. Ted's energy faded, his appetite disappeared, and his breathing became laboured. The Bell family watched helplessly as the youngest member of their close-knit clan gradually wasted away. Graham spent hours at Ted's bedside, reading to him, sharing his latest inventions and discoveries, trying to bring light into the growing darkness. Ted died when Graham was 15, and the loss devastated the entire family. But for Graham, it carried an additional burden. He began to believe that his own robust health and intellectual gifts came at the expense of his brother's life force. This survivor's guilt would manifest throughout his life as an almost desperate drive to justify his existence through achievement. He had to accomplish enough for both himself and the brother who would never have the chance. The tragedy also reinforced Graham's growing obsession with communication across barriers. Ted had died slowly, gradually becoming more isolated as his strength failed. Graham became determined that no one should ever be cut off from human connection due to physical limitations. Whether deafness, distance, or death itself, he would find ways to bridge the gaps that separated people from one another. As Graham approached his 16th birthday, his father made a decision that would change the course of his life. Melville Bell had been invited to demonstrate his visible speech system in London, and he decided to take Graham along as his assistant. For a teenager who had rarely travelled beyond Edinburgh, London was a revelation of possibility. The city, in 1863, was the heart of the largest empire in human history. Steam trains connected distant corners of the British Isles. Telegraph wires carried messages across continents in minutes. Gas lamps were beginning to illuminate the darkness, and there was talk of electric lighting that could turn night into day. Most importantly for Graham, London was home to the most advanced scientific institutions in the world. During their stay, Graham attended demonstrations at the Royal Institution, where the greatest scientists of the age revealed their latest discoveries. He saw Michael Faraday's experiments with electricity and magnetism. He observed chemical reactions that seemed to transform matter itself. He witnessed mechanical devices that performed tasks with precision beyond human capability. But perhaps most significantly, Graham encountered the work of Hermann von Helmholtz, a German scientist who was using electricity to create artificial speech sounds. Helmholtz had built a device that used electrical vibrations to stimulate tuning forks, producing sounds that resembled human vowels. When Graham saw this demonstration, something clicked in his mind that would drive his work for the next decade. If electricity could create artificial speech, could it also transmit real speech? Could vibrations be converted into electrical signals, sent across distances, and then converted back into sound? The idea seemed almost magical, but Graham had grown up in a household where the impossible was simply a problem waiting for the right solution. When Graham returned to Edinburgh, he was no longer the same person who had left. The boy who had been content to experiment in his father's workshop had glimpsed a world where science could reshape human existence itself. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that worried his family. While his older brother Melly pursued a more traditional path toward becoming a teacher, Like their father, Graham became consumed with understanding the relationship between sound, electricity, and human communication. His bedroom became a laboratory filled with makeshift devices and half-finished experiments. He built primitive electrical circuits using materials scavenged from around Edinburgh. He created vibrating membranes from animal skins stretched over wooden frames. He spent hours mapping the precise frequencies of different musical notes, trying to understand how sound waves could be mathematically described and potentially recreated. But Graham's obsession came at a cost. His health began to suffer from long nights spent hunched over his experiments. His social connections withered as he became increasingly absorbed in his work. His teachers complained that while he excelled in subjects related to his interests, he was failing in areas he considered irrelevant. The teenager who had once been merely distracted was now genuinely isolated, living more in the world of his imagination than in the reality around him. The Bell family's financial situation was also becoming precarious. Melville's work with visible speech, while intellectually groundbreaking, was not particularly profitable. The family relied on income from teaching elocution and speech therapy, work that was respectable but far from lucrative. Graham's expensive experiments and his neglect of practical studies worried his parents, who saw their youngest surviving son heading toward a life of impractical dreaming. Everything changed in 1865 when Graham turned 18. His formal education at the Royal High School was complete, but unlike his peers who were preparing for university or entering trade apprenticeships, Graham had no clear path forward. His father made what seemed like a practical decision. Graham would spend a year in London working as a student teacher at Weston House, a school for young gentlemen in the borough of Elgin. The position was meant to provide Graham with practical experience and steady income, while giving him time to mature and decide on a proper career. Instead, it became the crucible where his scattered interests would finally coalesce into a life's mission. Weston House specialised in educating students with learning difficulties, including several who were deaf or hard of hearing. For the first time in his life, Graham was working directly with individuals who faced the same communication barriers that had isolated his mother and would have eventually silenced his brother Ted. He saw how deafness cut people off, not just from sound, but from full participation in society. Deaf individuals were often considered mentally deficient simply because they couldn't communicate in conventional ways. They were denied education, excluded from professional opportunities, and condemned to lives of dependency and isolation. Graham began applying his father's visible speech methods with these students, but he went further. He started developing his own techniques for teaching speech to the deaf. He used his understanding of acoustics to help students feel vibrations and associate them with specific sounds. He created visual representations of sound waves that helped students understand concepts like rhythm and pitch without actually hearing them. The results were remarkable. Students who had been considered unteachable began to speak clearly and communicate effectively. Graham realized he had found something more valuable than any mechanical invention. He had discovered a way to unlock human potential that society had written off as lost. But even as Graham celebrated these successes, tragedy struck the Bell family again. His older brother Melly, who had seemed to be the healthiest and most stable of the three brothers, began showing symptoms similar to those that had killed Ted. The tuberculosis that seemed to haunt the Bell family had claimed its second victim. Melly's decline was swift and devastating. The brother who had shared Graham's childhood experiments, who had helped create the wheat husking machine, who had been Graham's closest companion and collaborator, was dying at age 25. Graham rushed back to Edinburgh to be with his family, but there was nothing he could do except watch another piece of his world disappear. Melly's death in 1867 shattered whatever remained of Graham's childhood. At 20, he was now the sole surviving son of a family that had once included 3 boys full of promise and ambition. The weight of representing his family's future, of justifying the lives that had been cut short, pressed down on him with crushing force. More immediately, Mellie's death left the Bell family in a desperate financial situation. Melville's income from teaching was insufficient to support the household, and Graham's work at Weston House, while fulfilling, paid barely enough to cover his own expenses. The family needed a dramatic change in circumstances, and it needed to happen quickly. Melville Bell made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential in the family's history. He'd been corresponding with educators in North America who were interested in his visible speech system. The opportunities there seemed far greater than anything available in Britain. In 1870, the Bell family sold their possessions, said goodbye to Scotland forever, and boarded a ship bound for Canada. The journey across the Atlantic took 3 weeks, and Graham spent most of it on deck despite rough weather, fascinated by the ship's communication systems. He studied how flags and lights were used to send messages between vessels. He observed how the ship's bell could carry different meanings depending on the pattern of rings. Most intriguingly, he learned about the underwater telegraph cables that now connected North America to Europe, allowing messages to travel between continents in minutes rather than weeks. These telegraph systems worked by converting written messages into electrical pulses that travelled through wires. Graham began to wonder whether the same principles could be applied to human speech. If telegraph operators could transmit dots and dashes electrically, why couldn't someone transmit the complex vibrations that make up the human voice? The idea consumed him during the long hours at sea. He filled notebooks with sketches and calculations, trying to work out how sound waves could be converted into electrical signals and then reconverted back into sound at the other end. The mathematics were beyond his current understanding, but the basic concept seemed sound. If he was right, it would be possible to carry on a conversation with someone hundreds or even thousands of miles away. When the Bell family arrived in Canada, they settled in Brantford, Ontario, a small but growing town that offered opportunities for Melville to establish a new teaching practice. The change of environment seemed to benefit the entire family. The cleaner air and less crowded conditions improved everyone's health, and there was a sense of possibility that had been missing during their final years in Scotland. For Graham, Canada represented a fresh start and a chance to pursue his interests without the weight of family history pressing down on him. He threw himself into helping his father establish their new life while continuing his own experiments with sound and electricity. The basement of their Brantford home became his workshop, filled with batteries, wires, and the various mechanical contraptions he built to test his theories about electrical communication. But Graham's ambitions extended far beyond the small town where his family had settled. He had heard about the opportunities available in the United States, particularly in Boston, where some of the most advanced work with deaf education was taking place. American educators were eager to learn about the Bell family's methods, and Graham sensed that the United States might offer the resources and intellectual community he needed to pursue his most ambitious projects. In 1871, at age 24, Graham made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He left his family in Canada and travelled to Boston to establish himself as a teacher of the deaf. He carried with him letters of introduction from prominent Canadian educators, samples of his father's visible speech materials, and a head full of ideas about electrical communication that seemed impossible to everyone except him. Boston in 1871 was a city in the midst of transformation. The Civil War had ended 6 years earlier, and the United States was experiencing unprecedented economic growth. New technologies were reshaping daily life with breathtaking speed. Railroads connected distant cities, factories produced goods with mechanical precision, and telegraph lines carried information across the continent almost instantaneously. Most importantly for Graham's future, Boston was home to some of the most progressive educational institutions in America. The city's wealthy elite were deeply committed to philanthropy and social reform, including efforts to improve education for individuals with disabilities. There was money available for innovative programs, and there was a genuine desire to help marginalized populations participate more fully in American society. Graham arrived in Boston with almost no money, no permanent housing, and no guaranteed employment. But he had something more valuable than financial security. He had a mission that gave his life meaning and a set of skills that no one else in America possessed. Within weeks of his arrival, he was teaching at the Boston School for Deaf Mutes, demonstrating techniques that allowed his students to communicate more effectively than anyone had thought possible. His success was immediate and dramatic. Students who had been considered hopeless cases began speaking clearly enough to be understood by hearing individuals. Parents who had resigned themselves to their children's isolation suddenly saw new possibilities for their futures. Word of Graham's methods spread quickly through Boston's tight-knit community of educators and philanthropists. But even as Graham established his reputation as a teacher, his mind remained focused on his electrical experiments. Every evening after his teaching duties ended, he returned to his rented room and continued working on the problem that had obsessed him since his voyage to America. How could human speech be transmitted electrically across long distances? The answer would come through an unlikely partnership that began in the spring of 1872. Thomas Sanders was a wealthy leather merchant whose 5-year-old son, George, had been born completely deaf. Traditional educators had told Sanders that his boy would never learn to speak, never attend regular school, and would likely spend his life dependent on others for basic communication. But Sanders had heard rumours about a young Scottish teacher in Boston who was achieving impossible results with deaf students. When Sanders first brought George to meet Graham Bell, the boy could only communicate through crude gestures and grunting sounds. Within 3 months of working with Bell's methods, George was forming recognisable words. Within 6 months, he was speaking in complete sentences that strangers could understand. The transformation was so dramatic that Sanders became convinced he was witnessing something close to a miracle. Sanders wasn't the only wealthy Bostonian whose life Bell had changed. Gardner Green Hubbard was a prominent lawyer and businessman whose teenage daughter Mabel had lost her hearing to scarlet fever when she was 5 years old. Unlike George Sanders, who had been born deaf, Mabel retained memories of sound and speech, which made her case both easier and more heartbreaking. She desperately wanted to return to the hearing world she remembered, but years of failed treatments had left her family resigned to her isolation. Bell's work with Mabel began as a professional relationship, but quickly became something deeper and more complex. Mabel was 17 when they met, intelligent, beautiful, and frustrated by the limitations that deafness had imposed on her life. Bell was 25, passionately committed to his work, but socially awkward and often isolated by his intense focus on his experiments. Their shared understanding of communication barriers created an immediate connection that surprised them both. As Bell worked with Mabel on speech techniques, he found himself thinking about her, even when they weren't together. She represented everything he was fighting for in his educational work, a brilliant mind trapped by society's inability to accommodate difference. But she also challenged him personally in ways that no one ever had. Mabel refused to be pitied or treated as fragile. She demanded that Bell treat her as an intellectual equal, and she pushed him to explain his ideas about electrical communication with the same precision he used in his teaching. Their relationship developed slowly, complicated by the social conventions of the time and the 12-year age difference between them. Bell was technically Mabel's employee, hired by her father to provide specialized instruction. Any romantic attachment would be professionally inappropriate and potentially scandalous. But as months passed, both Bell and Mabel began to realize that their connection transcended the formal boundaries of their teacher-student relationship. Meanwhile, Bell's evening experiments were becoming more sophisticated and more promising. He had moved beyond simple electrical circuits to create devices that could convert sound vibrations into electrical signals. His breakthrough came when he realized that the human ear itself provided the perfect model for his invention. The eardrum vibrates in response to sound waves, and those vibrations are transmitted through a series of small bones to the inner ear, where they're converted into nerve signals that the brain interprets as sound. Bell began constructing artificial eardrums using thin membranes attached to electrical contacts. When sound waves struck the membrane, it would vibrate and cause the electrical contacts to vary the current flowing through a wire. At the receiving end, another device would reverse the process, converting the varying electrical signals back into vibrations that could reproduce the original sound. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but the execution required a level of precision that pushed the limits of available technology. Bell needed membranes that were sensitive enough to respond to the subtle vibrations of human speech, but durable enough to maintain electrical contact through thousands of cycles. He needed electrical circuits that could amplify weak signals without distorting them beyond recognition. Most challenging of all, he needed to solve these problems with hand-built equipment in a rented room with no funding beyond what he earned from his teaching. Thomas Sanders and Gardner Hubbard watched Bell's progress with growing fascination and concern. Both men had become convinced that their children's teacher was a genius whose potential extended far beyond education. They saw Bell working 18-hour days, teaching during the day, and experimenting late into the night, wearing himself down with an intensity that seemed unsustainable. They also recognized that Bell's electrical experiments, if successful, could revolutionize human communication in ways that would make the telegraph look primitive. In early 1874, the two men made Bell an offer that would change the trajectory of his life. They proposed to fund his electrical experiments in exchange for a share of any patents that resulted from his work. Sanders and Hubbard would provide Bell with proper laboratory space, high-quality materials, and enough financial support to focus on his inventions without worrying about basic survival. In return, they would become his business partners in what they all hoped would become a profitable enterprise. Bell accepted the partnership with mixed emotions. The financial support would allow him to pursue his most ambitious ideas, but it also meant that his work would no longer belong entirely to him. More importantly, the partnership formalized his relationship with Gardner Hubbard, who was not only his business partner, but also the father of the young woman Bell was increasingly unable to stop thinking about. The new arrangement allowed Bell to establish a proper workshop in the basement of a building on Court Street in Boston. For the first time since leaving Scotland, he had access to high-quality electrical equipment, precision tools, and materials sophisticated enough to build the devices he had been imagining. He hired Thomas Watson, a skilled machinist and electrical technician, to help him construct and test his inventions. Watson was 20 years old, mechanically gifted, and fascinated by Bell's vision of electrical speech transmission. Unlike Bell, who approached the problem from a theoretical understanding of acoustics and human communication, Watson had an intuitive grasp of electrical circuits and mechanical construction. Together, they formed a partnership that combined Bell's scientific knowledge with Watson's practical skills. Their first major breakthrough came in the summer of 1874, when they successfully transmitted musical tones over electrical wires. Using a device Bell called the harmonic telegraph, they could send multiple telegraph messages simultaneously by using different musical frequencies for each message. The invention had immediate commercial potential, since existing telegraph systems could only carry one message at a time over each wire. But Bell remained focused on his ultimate goal of transmitting human speech. The harmonic telegraph proved that complex sound waves could be converted into electrical signals and transmitted over long distances, but speech required a level of fidelity that their current devices couldn't achieve. Human voices contain hundreds of different frequencies simultaneously, and capturing all of them electrically required innovations that pushed beyond anything that had been attempted before. As 1874 turned into 1875, Bell's experiments became increasingly sophisticated and increasingly secretive. He and Watson worked behind locked doors, aware that other inventors around the world were pursuing similar goals. Elisha Gray in Chicago had developed electrical devices that could transmit simple sounds. Thomas Edison in New Jersey was experimenting with ways to improve telegraph technology. Most threateningly, powerful corporations were pouring money into research that could make Bell's work obsolete before he could complete it. The pressure was enormous and relentless. Bell's financial backers expected results that could be commercialized quickly. His teaching responsibilities continued to demand most of his daytime hours. His relationship with Mabel Hubbard was deepening into love, but her father's role as his business partner complicated any possibility of marriage. Most exhausting of all, Bell was haunted by the fear that someone else would solve the problem of electrical speech transmission before he could complete his own work. The breakthrough finally came on March 10th, 1876, in a moment that would become one of the most famous accidents in the history of technology. Bell and Watson were testing a new version of their speech transmission device when Bell spilled sulfuric acid on his clothes. Without thinking, he called out to Watson, who was working in another room. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Those words, transmitted through their experimental device and heard clearly by Watson in the next room, proved that human speech could be converted into electrical signals, sent through wires and reconverted into intelligible sound at the receiving end. The telephone had been born not through careful planning but through a moment of panic that forced its inventors to test their device under real conditions. But even as Bell and Watson celebrated their success, they knew that their real work was just beginning. Proving that electrical speech transmission was possible was only the first step. They needed to improve the clarity and range of their device. They needed to solve the technical problems that would allow their invention to work reliably over long distances. Most critically, they needed to protect their discovery from the dozens of other inventors who were working on similar projects. The race to patent the telephone became one of the most intense and consequential intellectual property battles in American history. Bell filed his patent application on February 14, 1876, just hours before Elisha Gray filed a similar application for his own electrical speech transmission device. The timing was so close that decades of legal battles would follow, with millions of dollars and the future of human communication hanging in the balance. Bell's patent number 174,465, granted on March 7, 1876, would eventually be recognized as the most valuable patent ever issued. But at the time, few people understood the revolutionary implications of what Bell had accomplished. The telephone seemed like an interesting novelty, a clever improvement on the telegraph that might find specialized applications in business or government. Even Bell himself struggled to envision the full potential of his invention. He initially imagined the telephone as a device that would allow deaf individuals to communicate over long distances, or perhaps as a way for businesses to connect their offices without relying on telegraph operators. The idea that every home and business in America might eventually have its own telephone seemed absurdly optimistic. The first public demonstration of the telephone took place at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in June 1876. Bell had been reluctant to display his incomplete invention at such a prominent venue, but Mabel Hubbard convinced him that the exposure was necessary to attract investors and establish his priority as the telephone's inventor. The demonstration was scheduled for late in the day, after most of the important visitors had already seen the other exhibits. Bell set up his equipment in a corner of the electrical displays, competing for attention with Edison's improved telegraph systems and dozens of other inventions that seemed more immediately practical. The judges moved slowly through the exhibits, showing little interest in Bell's strange collection of wires and membranes. As the afternoon wore on, it seemed likely that they would run out of time before reaching his demonstration. Then Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil, who was touring the exhibition as a guest of honor, recognized Bell from a school for the deaf that the emperor had visited in Boston. Dom Pedro remembered being impressed by Bell's teaching methods, and he insisted that the judges examine Bell's invention despite the late hour. What followed was a demonstration that would change the course of human history. Bell positioned himself at one end of the exhibition hall and recited Hamlet's famous soliloquy into his telephone transmitter. At the other end of the hall, Dom Pedro held the telephone receiver to his ear and heard every word clearly transmitted through the electrical device. The emperor's amazed reaction drew a crowd, and soon dozens of prominent scientists, inventors, and journalists were taking turns listening to voices transmitted electrically across the exhibition hall. The telephone was no longer an unknown invention hidden in a Boston workshop. It was suddenly the most talked about technology at America's centennial celebration, and Bell found himself famous almost overnight. Newspaper reports describing the telephone appeared across the country, and letters began arriving from investors, potential customers, and other inventors who wanted to understand how Bell's device worked. But fame brought new challenges that Bell was unprepared to handle. Patent battles multiplied as competitors claimed they had invented electrical speech transmission before Bell. Business partners pressured him to focus on commercial development rather than technical improvements. Most personally difficult, his relationship with Mabel Hubbard had to navigate the complications created by his sudden celebrity and her father's business interests in his work. The success of the Philadelphia demonstration transformed Bell's life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Within weeks of returning to Boston, his modest workshop was flooded with visitors. Businessmen arrived with briefcases full of investment proposals. Scientists came seeking technical details about his acoustic principles. Reporters peppered him with questions about the commercial potential of his invention. The quiet Scottish teacher, who had preferred working alone in dimly lit rooms, suddenly found himself at the center of a media storm. But Bell's newfound fame came with a price that cut deeper than mere inconvenience. The telephone demonstrations required him to speak clearly and project his voice across large rooms filled with skeptical audiences. For someone who had spent his career helping others overcome speech difficulties, Bell discovered an uncomfortable irony. His own voice, when amplified by the pressure of public speaking, revealed a slight Scottish accent that made some Americans question his credibility as an inventor of communication technology. More troubling was the growing distance between Bell and the work that had originally inspired him. Teaching deaf students had been his passion, his calling, his way of honoring his mother's struggle with hearing loss. But as demand for telephone demonstrations increased, he found less and less time for the classroom. His most devoted students watched their teacher become increasingly distracted, pulled away by obligations that seemed to matter more to the world than their individual progress. The business pressures intensified throughout the summer of 1876. Thomas Sanders and Gardner Hubbard had invested heavily in Bell's work, but they needed to see returns on that investment quickly. The patent battles were expensive, requiring teams of lawyers to defend Bell's claims against increasingly sophisticated challenges. Competitors were developing their own versions of electrical speech transmission, some of which worked better than Bell's original design. Most significantly, the Western Union Telegraph Company, the most powerful communication corporation in America, had entered the telephone business. They hired Thomas Edison, already famous for his improvements to telegraph technology, to develop a telephone system that could compete directly with Bell's patents. Edison's telephone used a carbon microphone that produced clearer sound quality than Bell's magnetic design, and Western Union had the infrastructure and capital to deploy their system nationwide almost immediately. The David and Goliath nature of this competition was not lost on Bell. Western Union controlled thousands of miles of telegraph wires, employed armies of skilled technicians, and had relationships with businesses across the country. Bell's operation consisted of himself, Thomas Watson, a handful of investors, and a workshop that could barely produce a dozen telephones per month. If the battle came down to manufacturing capacity and distribution networks, Bell would lose decisively. But Bell possessed something that Western Union couldn't buy or steal. He understood human communication at a level that pure engineers couldn't match. His years of teaching deaf students had given him insights into how people actually use speech, how voices convey meaning beyond mere words, how communication barriers affect human relationships. When Bell designed telephone circuits, he wasn't just thinking about electrical efficiency. He was thinking about how mothers would speak to children, how lovers would whisper across distances, how business partners would negotiate deals without being in the same room. This deeper understanding manifested in subtle but crucial design decisions. Bell's telephones were calibrated to reproduce human voices with emotional nuance intact. The frequency response was optimized for speech intelligibility rather than musical fidelity. The volume levels were adjusted so that conversations felt intimate rather than mechanical. These refinements required more sophisticated engineering than Edison's carbon microphone approach, but they produced telephone conversations that felt remarkably natural. The first commercial telephone exchange opened in New Haven, Connecticut, in January 1878. Bell had envisioned telephone service as a point-to-point connection between specific locations, similar to telegraph lines. But the New Haven Exchange introduced a revolutionary concept. A central operator could connect any subscriber to any other subscriber using a switchboard system. Suddenly, owning a telephone meant access to a network rather than just a single connection. The implications were staggering. As more people subscribed to telephone service, the value of each individual telephone increased exponentially. A telephone connected to 10 other telephones was useful. A telephone connected to 100 other telephones was transformative. A telephone connected to thousands of other telephones was revolutionary. Bell had accidentally created not just a communication device, but the foundation for the first truly national network in American history. But even as the telephone business exploded around him, Bell felt increasingly disconnected from his original purpose. The man who had devoted his life to helping isolated individuals communicate was now part of a commercial enterprise that seemed driven purely by profit. Wealthy businessmen could afford telephone service, but the deaf students he had taught would likely never benefit from his invention. The irony was painful and constant. His relationship with Mabel Hubbard had also reached a crossroads that reflected these larger tensions. Bell's love for Mabel was genuine and deep, but their courtship was complicated by factors that went far beyond normal social conventions. Mabel's deafness meant that she couldn't participate in the telephone demonstrations that were making Bell famous. More problematically, her father's financial investment in Bell's work created a conflict of interest that made their personal relationship feel tainted by business considerations. In July 1877, Bell made one of the most important decisions of his life. Despite the enormous pressure to focus on telephone development, he asked Mabel to marry him. The proposal was not romantic in any conventional sense. Bell explained that he loved her not in spite of her deafness, but because of how her deafness had shaped her character. He had watched her overcome barriers that would have defeated most people. He had seen her refuse to accept limitations that society tried to impose on her. He wanted to spend his life with someone who understood that communication was about connection, not just sound. Mabel accepted, but she insisted on one condition that revealed her own understanding of Bell's character. She would marry him only if he promised to continue his work with deaf education, regardless of how successful the telephone business became. She had fallen in love with a teacher who was passionate about helping others overcome communication barriers. She refused to marry a businessman who had abandoned that calling for commercial success. They were married on July 11th, 1877, in a ceremony that reflected both their personal values and the unusual circumstances of their relationship. The wedding was held at the Hubbard family estate in Cambridge, with only close family and friends in attendance. Bell gave Mabel almost all of his shares in the Bell Telephone Company as a wedding gift, keeping only 10 shares for himself. It was a gesture that demonstrated his priorities. The woman he loved mattered more than the wealth his invention was generating. The honeymoon became an extended business trip that took the newlyweds to Europe, where Bell demonstrated his telephone to scientists and potential investors. But the journey also gave Bell his first opportunity in months to step back and reflect on what his life had become. Away from the constant pressure of patent battles and business meetings, he began to reconnect with the intellectual curiosity that had driven his original experiments. In London, Bell visited the Royal Institution, where he had first seen demonstrations of electrical science as a teenager. The same lecture hall where Michael Faraday had revealed the secrets of electromagnetic induction now hosted Bell's own demonstrations of electrical speech transmission. The symmetry was not lost on him. The boy who had once watched in wonder as scientists manipulated invisible forces was now the man teaching others about the practical applications of those same principles. But Bell's European tour also exposed him to criticisms that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Some European scientists dismissed the telephone as a clever toy rather than a serious scientific achievement. They argued that Bell was more of a talented tinkerer than a true inventor, someone who had stumbled upon a useful application for principles discovered by others rather than advancing human knowledge in any fundamental way. These criticisms stung because they contained elements of truth. Bell's understanding of electrical theory was largely self-taught and sometimes imprecise. He couldn't explain why his telephone worked in the mathematical terms that academic physicists preferred. His success had come through intuition and persistence rather than systematic scientific method. The professors who had dismissed him as a dreamy student now dismissed his invention as accidental rather than inevitable. When Bell and Mabel returned to America in November 1877, they found a telephone industry that was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. The Bell Telephone Company was installing new exchanges in cities across the country. Thousands of businesses were subscribing to telephone service. The device that had been demonstrated as a curiosity at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition was becoming an essential tool of American commerce. But rapid growth brought new challenges that tested Bell's character in ways he hadn't expected. The telephone company needed experienced managers, but Bell had no business training. Patent lawsuits were multiplying, requiring technical testimony that pulled Bell away from invention and development. Most frustrating, the commercial pressure to expand telephone service as quickly as possible led to technical compromises that reduced call quality and reliability. Bell found himself caught between his perfectionist instincts and the practical demands of running a growing company. As an inventor, he wanted to continue improving the telephone until it could reproduce human speech with perfect fidelity. As a businessman, he needed to deploy telephone systems that worked well enough to satisfy customers while generating the revenue required to fund further expansion. The tension between these competing priorities would define the rest of his career. The patent battles reached their climax in 1878 when Western Union filed a lawsuit claiming that Bell had infringed on patents held by Thomas Edison and Elisha Gray. The case, known as the Great Patent Suit, would determine who had the legal right to control telephone technology in America. The stakes could hardly have been higher. The winner would dominate one of the fastest growing industries in the world. The loser would be relegated to footnote status in the history of human communication. Bell's testimony in the patent case revealed both his strengths and limitations as an inventor. He could describe his telephone experiments in vivid detail, explaining exactly how he had solved specific technical problems. But when opposing lawyers pressed him on theoretical questions about electrical circuits and acoustic principles, his answers sometimes seemed uncertain or incomplete. He had invented the telephone through intuition and experimentation rather than systematic scientific analysis. The legal battle dragged on for months, consuming enormous amounts of time, money, and emotional energy. Bell found himself spending more time in courtrooms than in laboratories. The stress began affecting his health, and for the first time since leaving Scotland, he experienced the kind of respiratory problems that had killed his brothers. The possibility that he too might be vulnerable to the tuberculosis that haunted the Bell family added urgency to his desire to complete his most important work. In September 1879, the patent case was finally resolved in Bell's favour. The court ruled that he had indeed invented the telephone before his competitors and that his patents were valid and enforceable. Western Union agreed to abandon the telephone business and transfer their telephone assets to the Bell Telephone Company in exchange for a substantial cash settlement. Bell had won the most important legal battle in the history of communication technology, but victory in the patent war came at a cost that went beyond the obvious financial and emotional toll. Bell discovered that success in business required skills and compromises that were fundamentally at odds with his nature as an inventor and teacher. The telephone company needed him to be a public figure, a symbol of American innovation and entrepreneurial success. But Bell was most comfortable working quietly with small groups of students or collaborators, solving problems through patient experimentation rather than dramatic public demonstrations. The resolution of the patent battles also marked the end of Bell's direct involvement in telephone development. The Bell Telephone Company had grown into a large corporation with professional managers, experienced engineers, and standardized manufacturing processes. Bell's role shifted from inventor to figurehead, from problem solver to public spokesperson. The telephone would continue evolving and improving, but future innovations would come from teams of engineers rather than individual genius. For Bell, this transition was both liberating and melancholy. He was finally free to pursue other interests without the constant pressure of commercial deadlines and legal challenges. But he was also losing direct control over the technology that had made him famous. The telephone was no longer his personal creation. It had become an industrial product, shaped by market forces and corporate priorities rather than his vision of perfect human communication. As the 1870s drew to a close, Bell began planning for a new phase of his life that would allow him to return to his original interests while exploring entirely new frontiers of science and technology. The telephone had made him wealthy and famous, but it had also shown him the limitations of focusing on a single invention. The world was full of communication barriers that technology might overcome, and Bell was determined to tackle challenges that went far beyond electrical speech transmission. The man who had started as a teacher of the deaf and accidentally become the inventor of the telephone was about to embark on adventures that would take him from the depths of the ocean to the heights of the sky, from the frontiers of medical technology to the emerging science of genetics. The telephone was just the beginning of Alexander Graham Bell's war against the barriers that separate human beings from each other, and from the knowledge they need to improve their world. The 1880s opened with Bell facing a crisis that would reshape his understanding of invention, responsibility, and human mortality. On July 2nd, 1881, President James A. Garfield was shot by an assassin at a railway station in Washington, D.C. The bullet lodged somewhere in the president's torso, but doctors couldn't locate it using the crude surgical techniques available at the time. As Garfield lay dying, the medical establishment was essentially helpless, reduced to probing blindly with unsterilized instruments that caused more damage than the original wound. Bell received an urgent telegram from the White House. The president's physicians had heard about his electrical experiments and wondered if he could devise some method to locate the hidden bullet. It was an impossible request that would have daunted most inventors. Bell had 3 days to create a technology that didn't exist, test it thoroughly, and stake his reputation on its reliability in the most high-stakes medical emergency imaginable. Working around the clock in his Washington laboratory, Bell developed what he called an induction balance. The device used electromagnetic principles to detect metal objects buried in human tissue. A primary coil generated a magnetic field, while a secondary coil detected disturbances caused by metallic objects. When the coils were positioned over the bullet, the device should produce an audible tone that would guide surgeons to the exact location. The induction balance worked perfectly in laboratory tests. Bell could locate coins, nails, and bullet fragments hidden in slabs of meat with pinpoint accuracy. But when he brought the device to the White House and attempted to examine President Garfield, something went wrong. The detector produced inconsistent signals that seemed to indicate metal throughout the president's entire torso rather than at a single location. What Bell didn't know was that Garfield's bed contained a new type of mattress with metal springs woven throughout its structure. The electromagnetic field from his device was detecting the mattress springs rather than the bullet, making accurate diagnosis impossible. By the time Bell realized the problem, it was too late to redesign the equipment or conduct additional tests. President Garfield died on September 19, 1881, and Bell was left wondering whether better preparation or different design choices might have saved the president's life. The failure haunted Bell in ways that success never had. The telephone had brought him fame and fortune, but the induction balance represented something more important. This was technology designed to save lives rather than improve business efficiency. The stakes were immediate and personal rather than commercial and abstract. Bell had glimpsed the potential for invention to address human suffering directly, and the missed opportunity tormented him. But the Garfield incident also revealed something crucial about Bell's character. Failure didn't discourage him from attempting difficult projects. Instead, it clarified his priorities and sharpened his focus on problems that mattered beyond mere technical achievement. The man who had accidentally stumbled upon the telephone was deliberately choosing to tackle challenges where success could mean the difference between life and death. Bell's work with the induction balance led to the development of medical technologies that wouldn't be perfected until decades later. His electromagnetic detection principles became the foundation for metal detection devices used in airports and security checkpoints. More importantly, his approach to medical diagnosis through external sensing foreshadowed the development of X-ray imaging, ultrasound, and magnetic resonance imaging. Bell was pioneering the concept of seeing inside the human body without invasive surgery. Meanwhile, Mabel Bell was experiencing the joys and terrors of early motherhood under circumstances that would challenge any family. Their first daughter, Elsie May, had been born in 1878, followed by Marion in 1880. Both children were healthy and hearing, but Mabel worried constantly about their development. Would they inherit their mother's deafness? How would they learn to communicate in a household where their mother couldn't hear their cries or first words? Bell threw himself into studying child development with the same intensity he brought to his electrical experiments. He observed his daughters constantly, documenting their progress in acquiring language, their responses to different sounds, their methods of communicating before they could speak clearly. These observations would later influence his work in education, but they also revealed his deep anxiety about heredity and the transmission of disabilities across generations. The Bell household became an informal laboratory for studying human communication in all its forms. Bell installed speaking tubes throughout their Washington home so that Mabel could communicate with servants and visitors even when he wasn't present to interpret. He experimented with visual communication systems that would allow deaf family members to participate in group conversations. Most innovatively, he began developing what he called visible speech for the deaf, techniques that would allow his daughters to communicate with their mother through lip reading and gesture, even if they lost their hearing. But Bell's domestic experiments were interrupted by a tragedy that struck at the heart of his deepest fears about heredity and family survival. In August 1881, just weeks after President Garfield's death, the Bells' third child, Edward, was born prematurely and survived only a few hours. The loss devastated both parents, but it affected Bell in ways that revealed his growing obsession with the biological forces that shape human destiny. Bell had lost two brothers to what appeared to be hereditary tuberculosis. Now he had lost a son to complications that might also have genetic components. The pattern seemed ominous, suggesting that the Bell family carried biological weaknesses that could manifest in each generation. Bell began studying heredity with scientific rigor, reading everything available about the transmission of traits from parents to children. This research led Bell into territory that would define much of his later career, but also reveal troubling aspects of his thinking about human nature and social organization. He became convinced that many human problems, including deafness, mental illness, and criminal behavior, were primarily hereditary rather than environmental. If these traits were passed from generation to generation, Bell reasoned, then society had a responsibility to prevent their transmission through careful control of reproduction. These ideas were not unique to Bell. The eugenics movement was gaining popularity among educated Americans who believed that scientific principles could be applied to improve the human species through selective breeding. Bell's work with deaf education gave him credibility in discussions about hereditary disabilities, and his success with the telephone made his opinions on scientific matters carry unusual weight with the general public. But Bell's approach to eugenics was complicated by his personal relationships with deaf individuals and his professional commitment to their education. Unlike many eugenicists who advocated for institutional segregation or forced sterilization, Bell focused on what he called positive eugenics. Rather than preventing people with disabilities from reproducing, society should encourage reproduction among individuals with desirable traits like intelligence, health, and moral character. Bell's most controversial contribution to eugenics was his 1883 paper titled "Upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race." In it, he argued that the deaf community was becoming increasingly isolated from hearing society, leading to higher rates of intermarriage among deaf individuals and therefore higher rates of hereditary deafness. Bell proposed that deaf children should be educated in mainstream schools rather than specialized institutions, and that sign language should be discouraged in favor of oral communication methods that would help deaf individuals integrate with hearing society. These ideas put Bell in direct conflict with many leaders of the deaf community who viewed sign language as a rich and sophisticated form of communication rather than a barrier to social integration. The controversy would persist throughout Bell's life, with deaf advocates arguing that his oral education methods were based on hearing people's prejudices rather than deaf people's actual needs and preferences. But even as Bell became embroiled in debates about education and heredity, his mind was already turning toward challenges that seemed to have nothing to do with human communication. In 1881, he founded the journal Science, which would become one of America's most prestigious scientific publications. The journal reflected Bell's belief that scientific knowledge should be shared across disciplines rather than confined to specialized academic fields. Bell's work with science brought him into contact with researchers who were pushing the boundaries of human knowledge in every conceivable direction. Astronomers were mapping distant galaxies with unprecedented precision. Geologists were revealing the vast timescales of Earth's history. Biologists were beginning to understand the mechanisms of evolution and heredity. Bell absorbed these discoveries eagerly, looking for connections between different fields that might suggest new approaches to old problems. One connection that particularly intrigued Bell involved the relationship between sound, light, and electromagnetic radiation. His telephone had proven that sound waves could be converted into electrical signals and transmitted over long distances. But scientists were discovering that light behaved in ways similar to sound, traveling in waves that could be manipulated and controlled through various technologies. Bell began wondering whether light waves could carry information the same way that electrical signals carried telephone conversations. If sound could be transmitted through wires, could it also be transmitted through beams of light? The idea seemed fantastic, but Bell had learned not to dismiss seemingly impossible concepts without thorough investigation. Working with his assistant Charles Sumner Tainter, Bell developed what he called the photophone, a device that used light beams to transmit sound over short distances. The transmitter focused sunlight through a lens onto a thin mirror that vibrated in response to sound waves. The vibrating mirror caused the light beam to fluctuate in intensity, encoding the sound as variations in brightness. At the receiving end, a selenium cell detected these light variations and converted them back into electrical signals that could drive a telephone receiver. The photophone worked remarkably well under ideal conditions. Bell and Tainter could conduct clear telephone conversations using only beams of sunlight to carry their voices across distances of several hundred feet. The sound quality was often better than conventional telephone service, since light beams weren't affected by electrical interference from telegraph wires and power systems. But the photophone also highlighted the practical limitations that had plagued many of Bell's inventions. The device required bright sunlight to operate effectively, making it useless on cloudy days or during evening hours. Atmospheric conditions like fog, rain, or dust could block the light beam and interrupt communication. Most problematically, the photophone required a clear line of sight between transmitter and receiver, limiting its usefulness in urban environments where buildings and other obstacles blocked optical paths. Bell recognized that the photophone was ahead of its time, requiring technological advances in light sources and detection systems that wouldn't be available for decades. But he also understood that the basic principle was sound and would eventually lead to practical applications. His prediction proved remarkably accurate. More than a century later, fiber optic communication systems based on Bell's photophone principles would carry most of the world's long-distance telephone and internet traffic. The photophone experiments revealed something important about Bell's approach to invention. Unlike many of his contemporaries who focused on immediate commercial applications, Bell was willing to pursue ideas that might not become practical for generations. He was thinking about the fundamental principles that governed communication and transportation, looking for breakthrough concepts that could eventually transform human civilization, even if they couldn't be commercialized immediately. This long-term perspective became even more evident in Bell's next major project, which seemed to have no connection to his previous work with sound and communication. In 1882, Bell began experimenting with powered flight, decades before the Wright brothers would achieve their famous success at Kitty Hawk. Bell's approach to aviation reflected the same systematic methodology he had applied to the telephone and photophone, but it also revealed his growing confidence in tackling problems that had defeated humanity's greatest minds for centuries. Bell's interest in flight began with his observations of birds and his theoretical understanding of the forces that enable powered flight. He recognized that successful aviation would require solving three interconnected problems: generating sufficient lift to overcome gravity, providing enough thrust to achieve forward motion, and maintaining stability and control during flight. Previous aviation pioneers had typically focused on one of these challenges while neglecting the others, leading to spectacular failures that often proved fatal. Bell's systematic approach involved building and testing hundreds of different wing designs, engine configurations, and control systems. He constructed a series of kites that explored different approaches to generating lift, from traditional bird-like wings to geometric shapes that seemed to have no natural counterpart. Some of these kites were large enough to carry human passengers, and Bell conducted extensive tests to understand how changes in design affected stability and lift capacity. The most successful of Bell's experimental aircraft was a massive tetrahedral kite called the Cygnet. The structure consisted of thousands of small tetrahedral cells arranged in a honeycomb pattern that provided exceptional strength while remaining relatively lightweight. The Cygnet could carry a human passenger under favourable wind conditions, and it demonstrated remarkable stability even in turbulent air. But Bell's aviation experiments also revealed the limitations of his approach to invention. While his theoretical understanding of aerodynamics was sophisticated, he lacked the practical engineering skills needed to build reliable engines and control systems. The Cygnet could achieve flight under ideal conditions, but it couldn't take off independently or be controlled precisely enough for practical transportation. More fundamentally, Bell's interest in aviation was driven by scientific curiosity rather than immediate practical need. He wanted to understand the principles of flight and demonstrate that powered aviation was theoretically possible, but he didn't have a specific application in mind that would justify the enormous expense and risk of developing practical aircraft. The Wright brothers, by contrast, were focused on solving the specific problem of achieving controlled powered flight that could be commercialized as a transportation system. Bell's aviation work did contribute to the eventual success of powered flight, particularly in the areas of structural design and stability analysis. His tetrahedral cell construction technique influenced later aircraft designers, and his systematic approach to testing different configurations provided valuable data for other aviation pioneers. But his greatest contribution may have been in demonstrating that flight was an engineering problem rather than an impossible dream, encouraging other inventors to pursue practical solutions with greater confidence. The pattern that emerged from Bell's work in the 1880s would characterize the rest of his career. He was most successful when he combined theoretical understanding with immediate practical need, as he had with the telephone. He was less successful when he pursued interesting ideas without clear applications, as with the photophone and aviation experiments. But even his apparent failures often contained insights that proved valuable to later inventors, working with better tools and clearer objectives. As the decade progressed, Bell found himself pulled in multiple directions by competing interests and obligations. The Bell Telephone Company continued to require his attention for patent disputes and technical consultations. His work with deaf education remained a personal passion that demanded significant time and energy. His scientific research was generating fascinating results that deserved publication and further development, and his growing family needed a father who was present and engaged rather than constantly distracted by the next technical challenge. The tension between these competing demands would shape Bell's decisions throughout the 1890s as he struggled to balance his roles as inventor, businessman, educator, and family man. The boy who had once been content to experiment in his father's workshop was now responsible for technologies that employed thousands of people and affected millions of lives. The weight of that responsibility would drive him to achievements that went far beyond anything he had accomplished in his youth, but it would also force him to make choices that revealed the complex relationship between individual genius and social obligation. The resolution of these competing demands came through an unexpected tragedy that would redirect Bell's energies toward his most ambitious project yet. In 1888, Bell's infant son Robert died after living only a few hours, another devastating loss that echoed the deaths of his brothers and his earlier son Edward. But this time, instead of retreating into grief or throwing himself into unrelated technical projects, Bell channeled his anguish into a systematic assault on infant mortality itself. Bell had watched helplessly as 3 family members died from conditions that seemed preventable with better medical knowledge and technology. He refused to accept that such losses were simply the natural order of things. If human ingenuity could transmit voices across continents and enable machines to fly, surely it could also preserve the lives of newborn children who died for want of basic medical intervention. Working with Dr. Simon Newcomb, a prominent physician and astronomer, Bell began developing what they called a vacuum jacket, a device designed to assist breathing in premature infants and others suffering from respiratory distress. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. A flexible jacket surrounding the patient's torso would create alternating pressure and vacuum conditions that would mechanically assist lung function when natural breathing was insufficient. The vacuum jacket was essentially an early version of what would later become known as the iron lung, a device that would save thousands of lives during the polio epidemics of the 20th century. Bell's prototype could maintain artificial respiration for hours or even days, giving critically ill patients time to recover their own breathing capacity. The device worked by creating a sealed environment around the patient's chest and then using mechanical pumps to alternately increase and decrease air pressure, forcing the lungs to expand and contract in a regular breathing pattern. Testing the vacuum jacket required a level of medical collaboration that Bell had never attempted before. He couldn't simply build prototypes in his workshop and test them under controlled laboratory conditions. This invention had to work perfectly on the first attempt, with human lives hanging in the balance. Bell found himself learning not just about respiratory physiology and mechanical engineering, but about medical ethics, hospital protocols, and the complex relationship between innovation and patient safety. The first successful use of the vacuum jacket came in 1889, when Bell's device helped save the life of a premature infant at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. The baby had been born with severely underdeveloped lungs and was expected to die within hours. The vacuum jacket maintained artificial respiration for 3 days, long enough for the infant's lungs to mature sufficiently for independent breathing. The success was extraordinary, but it also revealed the emotional toll of medical invention. Bell had saved a life, but he carried the weight of knowing that every delay in perfecting the device might cost other lives that could have been saved. The vacuum jacket project brought Bell into contact with the emerging field of medical technology, where invention carried moral responsibilities that went far beyond commercial success or scientific recognition. Unlike the telephone, which improved convenience and business efficiency, medical devices literally determined who lived and who died. The pressure was enormous and constant, but it also gave Bell a sense of purpose that had been missing from his more abstract scientific work. But even as Bell celebrated the success of his life-saving invention, he was already turning his attention toward an even more ambitious challenge. The vacuum jacket could help individuals who were already in medical crisis, but Bell wanted to understand and address the root causes of human suffering. His work with deaf education had taught him that many problems labelled as medical conditions were actually social barriers that prevented people from reaching their full potential. This insight led Bell to one of his most controversial and ultimately transformative projects. In 1890, he established the Volta Bureau, an organisation dedicated to what he called the systematic improvement of human communication and learning capacity. The Bureau's mission was deliberately broad, encompassing research into heredity, education, technology, and social organisation. Bell wanted to attack human limitations from every possible angle simultaneously. The Volta Bureau became Bell's vehicle for pursuing ideas that were too speculative or long-term for commercial development, but too important to abandon. Working with a team of researchers that included educators, physicians, engineers, and social scientists, Bell began investigating questions that wouldn't be answered definitively until decades later. How do children acquire language? What role do genetics play in determining intellectual capacity? Can technology overcome biological limitations? How should society organize itself to maximize human potential? One of the Bureau's most significant projects involved developing new techniques for teaching speech to deaf children. Bell's methods had evolved considerably since his early work with visible speech, incorporating insights from his acoustic research and his growing understanding of child development. The Bureau's teachers achieved remarkable results, helping deaf students master spoken language to a degree that seemed impossible using traditional educational approaches. But Bell's success with oral education also intensified the controversy surrounding his views on deaf culture and sign language. Many leaders in the deaf community argued that Bell's emphasis on speech training was based on hearing people's prejudices rather than deaf people's actual needs. They contended that sign language was a complete and sophisticated form of communication that allowed deaf individuals to participate fully in their own cultural community. The debate reflected a fundamental philosophical difference about the nature of disability and social adaptation. Bell believed that deaf individuals would be happier and more successful if they could integrate seamlessly with hearing society through speech and lip reading. Deaf advocates argued that the problem wasn't deafness itself, but hearing society's unwillingness to accommodate different forms of communication. Both sides claimed to want what was best for deaf children, but they had irreconcilable views about what that meant in practice. The controversy followed Bell throughout the 1890s, complicating his reputation as a champion of human communication. The man who had dedicated his life to breaking down barriers between people was accused of creating new barriers by discouraging deaf children from learning sign language and participating in deaf culture. The irony was painful and persistent, forcing Bell to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between technological progress and social justice. Meanwhile, Bell's family life was entering a new phase that brought both joy and additional complexity. Mabel Bell had become a formidable intellect in her own right, using her position as the inventor's wife to advocate for women's education and social reform. She organised conferences on deaf education, wrote extensively about child development, and served on the boards of several educational institutions. The couple's partnership had evolved from teacher and student to intellectual collaborators working toward shared goals. Their daughters, Elsie and Marion, were growing into remarkable young women who combined their father's intellectual curiosity with their mother's social consciousness. Both girls were fluent in multiple languages, accomplished musicians, and sophisticated thinkers who challenged their parents' assumptions about education and social organisation. The Bell household had become a salon where prominent scientists, educators, and social reformers gathered to debate the most important questions of the age. But the success of Bell's family life was shadowed by his growing awareness of his own mortality and the limited time available to complete his most important work. The deaths of his brothers and children had made him acutely conscious that genetic factors might limit his own lifespan. At the same time, his success with the telephone had given him resources and influence that could be applied to problems far beyond anything he had attempted in his youth. This combination of urgency and opportunity drove Bell to make increasingly bold commitments during the 1890s. He expanded the Volta Bureau's research programs, invested heavily in experimental technologies that might not pay off for decades, and began writing extensively about his vision for humanity's technological future. Bell was no longer content to solve individual technical problems. He wanted to accelerate the entire process of human advancement through systematic application of scientific knowledge. One of his most prescient insights involved the potential for combining different technologies to create capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual parts. The telephone had demonstrated that sound could be transmitted electrically. The phonograph had shown that sound could be recorded and reproduced mechanically. Electric lighting was proving that energy could be distributed efficiently over long distances. Bell began imagining integrated systems that would combine these capabilities to create entirely new forms of human communication and entertainment. His vision included what he called the broadcasting telephone, a system that would allow a single speaker to address thousands of listeners simultaneously across vast distances. The concept was essentially radio broadcasting, but Bell's approach was based on telephone technology rather than the electromagnetic wave principles that would eventually make radio practical. He couldn't have known that his technical approach was flawed, but his understanding of the social implications was remarkably accurate. Bell predicted that broadcasting would transform education by allowing the world's best teachers to reach students in remote locations. He anticipated that it would revolutionize entertainment by making music and drama available to people who could never afford to attend live performances. Most significantly, he foresaw that broadcasting would change politics by enabling leaders to communicate directly with citizens without the filter of newspapers or local intermediaries. These predictions were decades ahead of their time, but they influenced Bell's decisions about how to invest his time and resources during the 1890s. He knew that most of his speculative projects would not succeed in their original form, but he believed that the research process itself would generate knowledge and techniques that future inventors could apply to practical problems. Bell was deliberately planting seeds that others would harvest. This long-term perspective became even more evident when Bell turned his attention to problems that seemed to have no connection to his previous work with communication technology. In 1896, he became fascinated with the challenge of desalinating seawater to provide fresh water for arid regions. The problem appealed to Bell because it combined fundamental scientific principles with urgent human needs, exactly the type of challenge where his interdisciplinary approach might yield breakthrough results. Bell's desalination experiments involved heating seawater to create steam, then condensing the steam back into liquid water that would be free of salt and other contaminants. The process was simple in concept but enormously challenging in practice. Heating large quantities of water required substantial energy inputs that made the process expensive. The equipment needed to handle hot steam, and salt water had to be resistant to corrosion and mechanical stress. Most problematically, the entire system had to be efficient enough to produce fresh water at a cost that communities could afford. Working with a team of engineers and chemists, Bell developed increasingly sophisticated desalination prototypes that addressed these technical challenges one by one. His final design used solar energy to heat the seawater, reducing the operating costs while demonstrating that renewable energy sources could power large-scale industrial processes. The efficiency improvements were substantial, but the technology was still too expensive for widespread adoption given the economic conditions of the 1890s. Once again, Bell found himself developing technology that was ahead of its time. Desalination wouldn't become economically viable until the mid-20th century, when advances in materials science and energy production made large-scale plants practical. But Bell's experimental work provided crucial insights that influenced later designers, particularly in the areas of corrosion resistance and energy efficiency. The pattern of pursuing important problems without immediate commercial viability reflected Bell's evolving understanding of his role as an inventor and public figure. The telephone had made him wealthy enough to fund a speculative research that might not pay off for decades. More importantly, his reputation gave him access to the scientific community and potential collaborators who could help tackle challenges that no individual could solve alone. Bell's approach to collaboration had evolved significantly since his early partnership with Thomas Watson. Instead of working with a single assistant who helped implement his ideas, Bell was now organizing teams of specialists who brought different types of expertise to complex problems. The desalination project included mechanical engineers who designed the heating and condensing systems, chemists who analyzed the water purification process, economists who calculated operating costs, and social scientists who studied the potential impact on affected communities. This multidisciplinary approach reflected Bell's growing conviction that humanity's most important challenges couldn't be solved through purely technical means. Successful innovation required understanding not just how technologies worked, but how they would interact with human, social, and economic systems. Bell was pioneering what would later be called systems thinking, an approach that considered the broader context and consequences of technological change. The evolution of Bell's thinking became even more evident when he turned his attention to what would become his most ambitious and enduring project. In 1898, Bell helped found the National Geographic Society, an organization dedicated to increasing and diffusing geographic knowledge through scientific research and public education. The Society's mission seemed far removed from Bell's work with communication technology, but it reflected his deepest convictions about the relationship between knowledge and human progress. Bell had always believed that ignorance was the greatest barrier to human advancement. The telephone could connect people across distances, but it couldn't eliminate the cultural and intellectual barriers that prevented meaningful communication between different groups. The National Geographic Society was Bell's attempt to address these deeper obstacles by systematically expanding human knowledge about the world and making that knowledge accessible to ordinary citizens rather than just academic specialists. Under Bell's leadership, the National Geographic Society sponsored expeditions to remote regions of the world, funded scientific research in fields ranging from archaeology to zoology, and published National Geographic magazine, which would become one of America's most influential educational publications. The Society's approach combined rigorous scientific methodology with compelling storytelling techniques that made complex subjects accessible to general audiences. Bell's vision for the National Geographic Society reflected his understanding that effective education required emotional engagement as well as factual information. The Society's expeditions were designed to capture public imagination through dramatic discoveries and stunning photography. The magazine featured vivid accounts of exploration and discovery that read like adventure stories while conveying serious scientific knowledge. Bell was applying entertainment principles to education decades before anyone used terms like edutainment or multimedia learning. The success of the National Geographic Society validated Bell's belief that there was enormous public appetite for knowledge when it was presented in compelling and accessible formats. The magazine's circulation grew rapidly, reaching hundreds of thousands of readers who had previously had little exposure to scientific research or global exploration. More importantly, the Society's work inspired young people to pursue careers in science and exploration, creating a new generation of researchers who would expand human knowledge throughout the 20th century. But Bell's work with the National Geographic Society also revealed the limitations of his approach to social reform. While the Society succeeded in educating middle-class Americans about distant places and exotic cultures, it did little to address the economic and political barriers that prevented most people from accessing quality education. Bell was improving the content and delivery of knowledge, but he wasn't changing the fundamental social structures that determined who had access to learning opportunities. This realization led Bell to his final major project, an ambitious attempt to demonstrate that systematic application of scientific knowledge could transform an entire community. In 1900, Bell purchased property on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, where he established what he called Bain Breg, a combination research laboratory, experimental farm, and model community designed to showcase the potential for technology to improve human life. Bain Breg became Bell's laboratory for testing ideas about sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, community organization, and technological innovation. The estate included workshops where Bell and his assistants developed new inventions, experimental farms where they tested improved agricultural techniques, and housing for researchers and their families who participated in the community's activities. Bell was attempting to create a microcosm of what human society could become if scientific principles were systematically applied to solve practical problems. The community attracted visitors from around the world who came to observe Bell's experiments and participate in discussions about technology and social progress. Bain Breg became a pilgrimage site for inventors, educators, and social reformers who shared Bell's vision of using science to improve the human condition. The conversations and collaborations that took place there influenced technological development and social policy throughout the early 20th century. But Bain Breg also represented the culmination of Bell's evolution from a practical inventor focused on immediate problems to a visionary thinker concerned with humanity's long-term future. The man who had started by helping individual deaf students communicate had expanded his mission to encompass nothing less than the systematic improvement of human civilization through the application of scientific knowledge and technological innovation. As the new century dawned, Bell found himself wrestling with a paradox that would define his final decades. At 53, he possessed more wealth, influence, and scientific credibility than most inventors could dream of achieving. Yet he was increasingly haunted by the sense that his greatest contributions lay not in what he had accomplished, but in what remained undone. The telephone had connected voices across continents, but Bell had glimpsed possibilities that made even that achievement seem modest by comparison. The catalyst for Bell's most revolutionary work came from an unexpected source. In 1901, his daughter Marion returned from a European tour with disturbing accounts of industrial conditions she had witnessed in Britain and Germany. Factories belched poisonous smoke that sickened entire neighborhoods. Workers labored in conditions that destroyed their health within years. Children as young as 8 operated dangerous machinery for 14 hours a day. The technological progress that Bell had championed was creating a world where human beings were treated as expendable components in vast industrial machines. Marion's reports forced Bell to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between technological advancement and human welfare. Had his work with the telephone contributed to a system that valued efficiency over humanity? Was scientific progress inevitably linked to social exploitation? Could technology be redirected toward improving human life rather than merely increasing industrial productivity? These questions consumed Bell with an intensity that surprised even his closest associates. Bell's response was characteristically systematic and ambitious. If industrial technology was creating human suffering, then better technology could eliminate that suffering. The problem wasn't science itself, but the narrow application of scientific knowledge to serve commercial interests rather than human needs. Bell began developing what he called humanitarian engineering, an approach that prioritized human welfare over pure efficiency or profit maximization. The first major project emerging from this philosophy involved revolutionizing workplace safety through technological innovation. Bell had learned that industrial accidents killed or maimed thousands of workers annually, most from causes that seemed entirely preventable with proper equipment and procedures. Working with safety engineers and industrial physicians, he began developing comprehensive systems that would protect workers without significantly reducing productivity. Bell's safety innovations went far beyond simple protective equipment. He designed lighting systems that reduced eye strain and prevented accidents caused by poor visibility. He created ventilation systems that removed dangerous fumes and particles from factory air. He developed mechanical aids that reduced the physical strain of heavy labor while improving the quality and consistency of manufactured products. Most importantly, he insisted that safety systems be integrated into the design of industrial equipment rather than added as afterthoughts. The humanitarian engineering approach required Bell to study industrial processes in unprecedented detail. He spent months observing workers in steel mills, textile factories, and chemical plants, documenting the specific hazards they faced and the ingenious methods they had developed to protect themselves. Bell discovered that workers often possessed practical knowledge about safety and efficiency that formally educated engineers had overlooked or dismissed. This realization led Bell to develop collaborative design methods that incorporated worker knowledge into technological innovation. Instead of imposing solutions developed in isolated laboratories, Bell's teams worked directly with experienced workers to identify problems and test potential solutions under real working conditions. The approach was revolutionary, challenging the conventional assumption that scientific expertise was superior to practical experience. The results exceeded even Bell's optimistic expectations. Factories that implemented his safety systems experienced dramatic reductions in accident rates while simultaneously improving productivity and product quality. Workers who had been treated as interchangeable components became valued collaborators in continuous improvement processes. Most significantly, Bell demonstrated that humanitarian goals and economic objectives were not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing when approached systematically. But Bell's industrial safety work also revealed the enormous resistance to change that characterized established institutions. Factory owners who had invested heavily in existing equipment were reluctant to modify systems that appeared to be profitable. Insurance companies that calculated premiums based on historical accident rates were slow to recognize improvements in safety performance. Labor unions that had developed adversarial relationships with management sometimes viewed Bell's collaborative approach with suspicion. Overcoming this resistance required Bell to become something he had never intended to be, a political advocate who used his reputation and influence to promote systematic changes in industrial policy. He testified before congressional committees investigating workplace safety. He published articles in popular magazines explaining how technological improvements could benefit both workers and employers. He organized conferences where business leaders, labor representatives, and government officials could examine successful safety implementations firsthand. The political dimension of Bell's work brought him into contact with reform movements that were reshaping American society during the Progressive Era. He collaborated with activists working to improve urban housing, expand educational opportunities, and protect natural resources. Bell discovered that his technological expertise could contribute to social reform efforts that extended far beyond industrial safety. One of the most significant collaborations involved Bell's work with conservationists who were developing the philosophical and scientific foundations for environmental protection. Bell had always been fascinated by natural systems, but his engineering background gave him unique insights into the relationship between technological development and ecological sustainability. He began studying how industrial processes could be modified to minimize environmental damage while maintaining economic viability. Bell's environmental work was decades ahead of its time, anticipating concerns that wouldn't become widespread until the late 20th century. He investigated renewable energy sources that could reduce dependence on coal and oil. He designed industrial processes that recycled waste materials rather than dumping them into rivers and landfills. He studied agricultural techniques that maintained soil fertility while increasing crop yields. Most prescient, he warned that uncontrolled industrial growth could alter global climate patterns with catastrophic consequences. The environmental research led Bell into territory that challenged his fundamental assumptions about progress and human destiny. Throughout his career, he had believed that technological advancement was inherently beneficial, that scientific knowledge would inevitably improve human life and expand human capabilities. But his ecological studies revealed that technology could also destroy the natural systems that supported human civilization. This realization forced Bell to develop a more sophisticated understanding of progress that balanced technological capability with ecological sustainability. He began advocating for what he called regenerative technology, innovations that enhanced human welfare while strengthening rather than depleting natural systems. The concept was revolutionary, requiring engineers to consider long-term environmental consequences rather than focusing exclusively on immediate functional objectives. Bell's regenerative technology projects included experimental systems that demonstrated the feasibility of sustainable industrial development. He designed factories that generated their own renewable energy and recycled all waste materials. He created agricultural systems that increased productivity while improving soil quality and protecting water resources. He developed transportation technologies that moved people and goods efficiently while minimizing environmental impact. The most ambitious of these projects was Bell's attempt to create a completely sustainable community at Bedtime. The estate became a living laboratory where every aspect of human activity was redesigned to work in harmony with natural systems. Buildings were constructed using local materials and renewable energy sources. Food was produced using agricultural techniques that enhanced rather than depleted soil fertility. Waste products were composted or recycled rather than discarded. The Bedtime experiments attracted international attention from scientists, engineers, and social reformers who recognized the significance of Bell's integrated approach to sustainability. Visitors came from across Europe and North America to study techniques that seemed to offer a path toward industrial development that enhanced rather than destroyed environmental quality. The community became a pilgrimage site for early environmentalists who were searching for practical alternatives to destructive industrial practices. But Bell's sustainability work also highlighted the enormous challenges involved in scaling experimental solutions to address global problems. The techniques that worked brilliantly at Bedtime required levels of knowledge, skill, and financial resources that were far beyond what most communities could access. The integrated systems that Bell had developed were too complex and expensive to be replicated widely using available technologies and economic structures. Alexander Graham Bell died on August 2nd, 1922, at his beloved Bain Brugh, surrounded by the family and community he had spent decades building. The man who had connected the world through the telephone had ultimately discovered something far more profound: that true innovation lies not in conquering nature or replacing human connection, but in understanding how technology can serve humanity's deepest needs for communication, healing, and progress. His legacy reminds us that the greatest inventors are not those who create the most devices, but those who never stop asking how their work can bridge the gaps that separate us from each other and from our highest potential.